Everything you asked for is in here. Signatures, timestamps, the whole chain. Take a look before we go any further. I need you to acknowledge receipt. No misunderstandings later.
I've got it.
The black SUV sat beneath the unforgiving afternoon sun in the crowded parking lot of La Vista Mall. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, blurring the white lines between rows of cars. It was a typical Saturday families unloading shopping bags. Teenagers laughing near the food court entrance. The low hum of engines mixing with the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. Nothing about the scene felt unusual. Judge Angela Morrison, 55 years old, moved calmly as she placed a paper bag of groceries into the open trunk of her vehicle. Her posture was relaxed. Her movements unhurried. She wore no robe, no insignia, no visible mark of authority. To anyone passing by, she was simply another black woman finishing her errands before heading home. She closed the bag carefully, adjusting it so nothing would spill, unaware that the ordinariness of the moment was about to fracture. "Ma'am, step aside now." The voice cut through the ambient noise firm. Practiced. Unmistakably authoritative. Morrison straightened slowly. She turned to see Officer Jeff Caldwell approaching from between two parked cars. His uniform crisp, his expression fixed. One hand hovered near his service weapon, not touching it, but close enough to signal intent. His eyes swept the area briefly, as if danger might materialize at any second. The parking lot seemed to quiet. Shoppers nearby slowed their pace. A couple stopped altogether. Sensing tension without yet understanding it, Morrison met the officer's gaze. Her expression composed, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" "Officer." Caldwell stopped a few feet away. "I need you to step away from the vehicle." No explanation, no accusation, just a command. In that moment, under the open sky and the watchful sun, an ordinary Saturday began to slip into something else entirely, an encounter where authority would soon collide with the law itself. Morrison did not move. She remained beside the open trunk, one hand resting lightly on the edge as she looked directly at the officer. There was no fear in her expression, no defiance either, just focus. "Is there a legal reason you're asking me to step away from my vehicle?" she asked. Officer Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected compliance, not a question. "I need you to do as you're told," he replied. His voice clipped. "This won't take long." Morrison tilted her head just enough to signal consideration. "Not submission. I'm loading my own car with my purchases. What reasonable suspicion do you have that justifies this stop?" The words landed heavier than she intended, but they were precise, measured, legal. Caldwell shifted his weight. His gaze flicked briefly toward the license plate, then back to her face. For a split second, uncertainty crept in. Then it hardened into irritation. "I need to see some identification," he said. Around them, the sounds of the parking lot continued, shopping carts rolling. A car door slamming. Distant laughter, but something had changed. A middle-aged man slowed his walk, glancing back over his shoulder. A young woman paused near her car, watching. Morrison didn't raise her voice. "These are my purchases," she said calmly. "My vehicle is properly registered. I have not committed a crime." Caldwell took a half-step closer, his posture tightening. "You need to cooperate," he said, the emphasis unmistakable. The sun flashed off the metal of his badge, a brief glare that felt less like authority and more like pressure. What began as a routine command was now edging into something else, an assertion of power without explanation. And people nearby were beginning to notice. Morrison held her position. She did not step back. She did not raise her hands. She did not escalate. Instead, She reached slowly into her purse. Her movements deliberate and visible. She removed her wallet and opened it carefully, angling it so the contents were clear. Inside were 3 forms of identification: her driver's license, a federal judiciary identification card, and courthouse security credentials. Laminated. Official. Unmistakable. She held them steady. "These are valid," Morrison said evenly. "You are detaining me without reasonable suspicion. That constitutes a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." The words hung in the air. Officer Caldwell stared at the credentials, his eyes flicking from one card to the next. For the first time since the encounter began, he did not immediately respond. A woman parked 2 rows over raised her phone, holding it chest high, recording from roughly 20 feet away. Another shopper slowed to a stop, curiosity giving way to concern. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "I need to verify this," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. He took a step back, glancing around the parking lot. The ordinary rhythm of Saturday shopping had fractured. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. A small circle of witnesses was forming. Morrison did not lower the credentials. "I have shown you official identification," she said. "I am not suspected of any crime. You have no legal authority to detain me." The sunlight caught the embossed lettering on the federal ID, flashing briefly. United States Circuit Court. Caldwell noticed it. And in that moment, something shifted not toward resolution, but toward tension. Because what should have ended the encounter was now threatening something far more dangerous to him: public doubt and public eyes. Phones began to rise quietly, almost instinctively. One, then another. A young woman leaned against her car, recording steadily. A man near the cafe entrance lifted his phone higher, angling for a clear view. No one spoke loudly, but the silence itself carried weight. This was no longer a private exchange between an officer and a citizen. It was being witnessed. Judge Angela Morrison felt the shift immediately. She did not look away. Instead, her gaze swept briefly across the small gathering, acknowledging their presence without inviting reaction. Her composure remained intact, controlled, purposeful. She understood what visibility meant, long before she ever wore a robe. Morrison had studied moments like this from the other side. Born in Atlanta in 1968, she grew up in a neighborhood where police lights were a familiar part of the night sky. Her parents, both educators, taught her early that the law could be a shield or a weapon depending on who wielded it. As a young attorney, she had represented families stopped without cause, questioned without explanation, detained without dignity. She had seen how quickly authority could harden when challenged, and how easily silence could be mistaken for consent. That history shaped her now. Back in the parking lot, Officer Caldwell sensed the crowd. He shifted his stance, squaring his shoulders. What had begun as a routine assertion of control was now unfolding under public scrutiny. Morrison held her credentials steady. "I am not resisting," she said calmly. "I am asserting my constitutional rights." The words were deliberate, measured for the cameras now pointed in their direction. The situation had crossed a threshold. Whatever happened next would not disappear with the end of a shift. It would live on in recordings, in memory, and in consequence. Judge Angela Morrison had not arrived at that parking lot by chance. Her presence there was the culmination of decades spent navigating the very systems now pressing against her. After earning her law degree at 24, she joined a small civil rights firm in Atlanta, one that handled cases few others wanted. Long nights, thin resources, clients who had already lost faith in the system meant to protect them. She learned early that justice was not loud. It was precise, case by case. She challenged housing discrimination, police misconduct, and voter suppression. Many of those cases never made headlines. Some were lost. But each one sharpened her understanding of how authority behaves when unchecked. By the late 1990s, Morrison was arguing before appellate courts. Her reputation grew not for theatrics, but for clarity. Judges noted her restraint. Opposing counsel respected her preparation. She spoke only when the law supported her. And when she did, it landed. A decade later, she was appointed to the federal bench as a United States Circuit Court judge. Morrison presided over cases that shaped civil liberties across multiple states. Her opinions were cited in rulings on unlawful stops, excessive force, and the constitutional limits of police authority. She wrote with discipline, grounding every conclusion in evidence, every standard in precedent. She understood power because she had spent her career containing it. Across the parking lot, Officer Jeff Caldwell felt the weight of eyes on him. What he did not know, what he could not see, was that the woman standing calmly before him had authored opinions that guided how officers like him were judged. Her rulings influenced training manuals, departmental policies, and the very boundaries of lawful conduct. Two life paths, formed in entirely different worlds, had converged in this single moment, and neither could step away without consequence. Officer Jeff Caldwell had worn a badge for nearly 2 decades. He grew up in the suburbs of the same city he now patrolled. His father had praised structure, order, obedience. Joining the police force straight out of high school felt natural an entry into authority. A uniform that commanded respect. For years, Caldwell did exactly what was expected. He arrived early, filed reports on time, followed procedure, at least on paper. Supervisors noted his reliability. Commendations came quietly, but beneath the surface, a pattern formed. In his patrol zone, stops became sharper, voices firmer. Encounters with minority citizens escalated more quickly than necessary. Complaints were filed, some formal, some whispered, but internal reviews rarely went far. Each time nothing happened, a lesson was reinforced. Authority, once asserted, would be protected. Caldwell learned that hesitation invited challenge. That backing down looked like weakness. That control had to be visible, especially in public. Standing in the mall parking lot now, with cameras pointed in his direction, those instincts flared. The woman before him did not look afraid. She did not rush to comply. She spoke the language of the law with unsettling ease. To Caldwell, that felt like a threat. In his mind, this encounter was no longer about groceries or identification. It was about whether he maintained control in front of witnesses. Releasing her now would raise questions. Questions could unravel narratives he had relied on for years. So he squared his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said again, louder this time, "I need you to cooperate." The crowd edged closer. Phones remained raised. The moment stretched thin. What Caldwell did next would not just define the stop. It would expose the limits of his judgment. The air in the parking lot felt heavier now. More people had stopped walking. A loose semicircle formed at a distance close enough to see, far enough to stay safe. Phones were held steady. Lenses trained on the scene. No one shouted. No one interfered. They were watching. Judge Morrison felt the shift, but did not react to it emotionally. Her hands remained visible, her posture upright, her voice calm. "Officer," she said, "I have complied with every lawful request. I have identified myself. I am not suspected of a crime." Caldwell heard her words, but what he felt was the crowd. He noticed the way heads tilted when Morrison spoke, the way a few people nodded, the way doubt was spreading, silently, from one face to another. This was no longer an interaction he controlled. To him, retreat now meant surrendering authority in public. And that was unacceptable. "I've asked you multiple times," Caldwell said, his tone sharper, louder than before. "Turn around." A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is he arresting her?" Another voice followed. Confused. For what? Morrison paused for a brief moment, not in fear, but in calculation. She understood exactly what was happening. She had ruled on cases that began just like this. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around. "I am not resisting," she said clearly. Her voice meant for every camera recording. "I am complying under protest." Caldwell reached for the handcuffs. The metal clicked shut around her wrists. The sound cut through the parking lot sharp, unmistakable. Gasps followed. Phones rose higher. A few people took involuntary steps forward. A black woman, handcuffed, in broad daylight, for loading groceries. Caldwell exhaled, as if the decision had already been made long before this moment. But the expressions around him told a different story. This was no longer control. It was escalation, and there was no turning back. The patrol car door opened with a sharp metallic scrape. Judge Angela Morrison walked steadily, her hands cuffed behind her back, her expression composed. She did not look at the crowd as she passed, but she was aware of every lens following her movement. Every step was being recorded, every second preserved. She lowered herself into the back seat of the patrol car without resistance. The door closed. The sound was dull, final. Inside, the air felt tight. The plastic bench pressed cold against her legs. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with leather and heat. Outside, the world continued, engines starting, carts rolling, but inside the car, time seemed suspended. Caldwell slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale. The radio crackled softly, filling the silence with fragments of other calls, other moments of authority unfolding elsewhere. Neither spoke. Morrison's breathing remained slow, controlled. Her mind moved quickly, cataloging details with precision. The time of detention, the sequence of commands, the presence of witnesses, the visible cameras. She had spent years evaluating evidence. Now, she was living it. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Morrison watched reflections slide across the window storefronts. Traffic lights, passing faces. She understood the gravity of what had just occurred. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was an unlawful arrest. In the front seat, Caldwell's eyes flicked repeatedly to the rearview mirror. Each glance betrayed a growing awareness that the situation had crossed into dangerous territory. Verification could have ended this minutes ago. Instead, he had chosen control. The patrol car moved toward the station, carrying with it not just a detained citizen but the full weight of a decision that would soon be impossible to justify. The fluorescent lights inside the police station cast a harsh, unforgiving glow across the tiled floor. Judge Angela Morrison was escorted through the processing area, her cuffs still secured, her posture upright. Officers glanced up from their desks, some briefly, some longer than they intended. Something about the scene felt wrong. Even before anyone said a word, Officer Jeff Caldwell handed over the paperwork with clipped efficiency. His voice was steady, but his movements were not. Suspicious behavior, failure to comply. He said, "Officer Carmen Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran." accepted Morrison's belongings for cataloging. Keys, phone, wallet. Then she saw the identification. Rodriguez paused. The laminated card caught the light. The seal. The lettering. The unmistakable emblem. Her eyes flicked up once to Morrison's face. Then back down again. Without comment, she turned and walked briskly toward the supervisor's office. Moments later, Lieutenant Sarah Freeman stepped into the processing area. 25 years on the force had taught her to read rooms instantly. Her gaze moved from Morrison's cuffs to Caldwell's rigid stance, to the ID now in her hand. "What's going on here?" Freeman asked. Morrison spoke before Caldwell could answer. "I am Judge Angela Morrison, United States Circuit Court," she said calmly. "I was detained without reasonable suspicion." The room seemed to contract. Freeman studied the credentials carefully. No skepticism, just recognition. She picked up the phone. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When Freeman hung up, she did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "It's confirmed," she said quietly. "Federal Judiciary. Circuit Court." Caldwell felt the color drain from his face. Everything he had relied on assumptions. Authority. Momentum collapsed in that instant. The cuffs suddenly felt louder. The paperwork heavier. The room far too small. This was no longer a questionable stop. It was a constitutional violation. And everyone in that room knew it. Lieutenant Freeman stepped closer. "Remove the cuffs," she said. The words were quiet, absolute. Officer Caldwell hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everyone in the room to notice, then reached forward. The metal clicked open. Softer this time. Almost embarrassed. Judge Angela Morrison rubbed her wrists once. Slowly. No dramatics. No visible anger. Just composure. She straightened her jacket. The balance of the room had shifted. Caldwell stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. The authority he had carried into the parking lot now felt hollow. Every procedural shortcut, every ignored warning sign from his past, pressed down on him at once. Lieutenant Freeman turned to him. "You will document this incident in full," she said. "Every command, every decision. Then you will notify Internal Affairs." Caldwell nodded. Swallowing hard, Morrison retrieved her belongings methodically. Phone, wallet, keys. She checked each item, not out of mistrust, but habit. Years of legal discipline did not disappear under pressure. This detention lasted nearly 2 hours. She said calmly. There was no probable cause, no lawful basis. Freeman met her eyes. "You're correct." Outside the station, the story was already moving. Videos from the mall parking lot were circulating online. Millions of views accumulating by the hour. Comment sections filling with disbelief. Anger. Recognition. What had begun as a routine assertion of authority was now impossible to contain. Caldwell realized something then. This was no longer about one bad decision. It was about everything that decision represented. By the next morning, the footage was everywhere. Clips from the parking lot shot from half a dozen angles flooded social media. The commands, the questions left unanswered. The sound of handcuffs closing around a woman whose only act had been loading groceries. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Federal judge detained without cause. Routine stop escalates into constitutional violation. The city's initial silence only amplified public outrage. Internal Affairs opened an investigation immediately. Caldwell was placed on administrative leave. His prior record, once buried under procedural language and quiet dismissals, was reopened with fresh scrutiny. Patterns emerged. Disproportionate stops. escalations without cause, complaints that had been minimized, reframed, or ignored. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents now formed a clear trajectory. Judge Morrison's legal team moved with precision. The federal complaint outlined unlawful detention, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. Every claim was supported body camera footage, mall security video, witness statements. There was no room for ambiguity. Yet Morrison herself remained notably restrained. She did not give interviews filled with anger. She did not frame the incident as personal vengeance. Instead, she spoke about process, oversight, accountability. "This is not about me," she said in a brief statement. "It's about ensuring the law applies equally, especially when power is involved." For Caldwell, the weight was inescapable. What had once felt protected by routine now stood exposed, examined not by one supervisor, but by an entire public, and there would be consequences. The investigation concluded quietly but decisively. Officer Jeff Caldwell was terminated from the force. His pension eligibility was revoked. He was barred from future law enforcement employment. The findings were unambiguous: unlawful detention, failure to establish reasonable suspicion, and escalation driven by improper judgment. The city moved quickly after that. New policies were introduced: mandatory bias training, clearer standards for stops and detentions, and expanded authority for a civilian review board with investigative power. Procedures that once relied on discretion were now bound by documentation and oversight. The lawsuit ended in a substantial settlement. Judge Angela Morrison accepted it and then donated every dollar to civil rights organizations focused on police accountability and legal education, clinics that trained citizens to understand their rights, programs that taught officers the limits of their authority. She turned consequence into correction. In the months that followed, the incident became a case study in law schools, community forums, and judicial training seminars. Students dissected the Fourth Amendment violations. Instructors paused the footage at critical moments, asking a single question: where should it have stopped? The answer was always the same. At the beginning, this was never just about a judge. It was about what happens when authority is exercised without restraint and what happens when it is witnessed. Because power, when unobserved, tends to expand. But under scrutiny, it contracts. The law does not protect itself. It depends on those willing to assert it calmly, document it carefully, and demand accountability without vengeance. On an ordinary Saturday afternoon, in a mall parking lot, that truth was recorded frame by frame, and it changed everything.